Reverberation is the effect of sound waves reflecting off a surface. Those sound waves bounce around and will react very differently depending on what the surface is constructed from. For example, sound will reflect off a shiny surface more readily than a textured surface. Reverb is one of the most commonly used effects, and it can be used on any instrument or voice to add life to it. In the early days of multi-track recording, there were many different ways of achieving reverb. Some studios had large echo chambers that they would point a loudspeaker into, where they would then feed a vocalist's performance. The resulting sound reflections would then be captured by another microphone. Another method was the plate reverb. The plate is a warm-sounding reverb that was achieved by feeding a sound into an electrical transducer that is mounted on a suspended thin steel plate within a heavy steel frame. The resulting vibrations decay through the plate and are captured by pickups mounted at opposite ends of the plate. Plate reverbs are commonly heard on vocals, although nowadays they are mostly generated digitally. Spring reverb is common in a lot of classic amplifiers. It has a very distinctive sound and is a key ingredient to surf music. These amps have long springs mounted inside a metal box known as a reverb pan in the bass. An audio signal is fed into one end, converting it into waves that then pass through the springs and mixes it with the dry guitar signal at the other end. One notable thing with a spring reverb is the noise that results when the amp is knocked or bumped. I'm going to play through a few different reverbs and I'll discuss some of the parameters as we go. As I mentioned earlier in this chapter, in the olden days, reverbs had to be captured using some pretty elaborate methods. Some of the studios had massive big concrete chambers built into them just to be able to capture reverb. The plate reverbs were big and cumbersome and not something you could fit into your gig bag and take to a show. So, nowadays we're lucky that pedals are, so compact but yet contain so much. So, when I was playing guitar through the early 80s, you bought a Boss pedal and it had a single reverb on it. You didn't have multiple effects like you do nowadays, and that's the great thing with living in the digital age. These two digital reverbs that I have here, I have a Digitech one and the Boss one, both have multiple reverbs in them that model some of those classics from the olden days. So let's have a look at what these pedals contain and basically some of the parameters that go with it. The first thing I want to mention about this Boss RV5 is that it's got stereo inputs as well as stereo outputs. Now, reverb would generally be one of the last pedals in your effects chain, so you would feed it with something like a stereo chorus, for instance. A chorus would possibly go after your preamp, and then your chorus would then feed into the inputs of the reverb, and then the stereo outputs of the reverb would feed into a stereo power amp or two channels on a mixing desk or two separate amps, whatever you've got. So, stereo reverbs can really give you more depth and atmosphere and a richer sound. Let's have a look quickly at the different models and parameters of this particular pedal. At the start of the chapter, I just played this. Now, that's just the dry signal, and it's pretty boring. So what I did was use the modulate model, which adds modulation to the reverb trails. So kind of like adding chorus to the end of a reverb. So you can hear kind of a little bit of depth in the actual reverb there. I'll play it again. So all of a sudden it's become this really beautiful ethereal type sound, almost like I'm playing in a cavern or a cave, something like that. So you've got a lot of control over the overall sound of your reverb from here. You've got the effect level, and this governs how much of the actual reverb is mixed in with your dry signal. So set to its minimum. There's no reverb. As I bring it up, a little bit of reverb comes in. And I've got it at its maximum now. Then if I move along to the second from the right, we've got the time. This is how long the reverb will ring out for. And you can set it to quite short reverb times. Hear how the reverb dies out quite quickly. So sometimes the time is called the decay. So in this case, the decay is very short. But as I bring the level up, it starts becoming considerably longer. As I set it to its maximum, we'll probably get a few seconds of decay time. So obviously long decay times can add a lot more drama to the sound. And then you would blend it with the amount of level that you want to hear mixed in with your dry signal. This pedal also has a tone control which only affects the tone of the reverb. So if you want the tone of the reverb to be, for instance, quite trebly, I'll just get a bit more level there. Or you can turn it down, which will make the reverb tone a little bit warmer. Hear how the reverb tone almost sounds a bit muffled now? For me, I like quite a bright reverb, but it depends on the tone you're starting with, whether it's clean, dirty, so on. So let's just move through some of the different modes here. I'll start at the top. Spring reverb, which simulates the spring reverbs that were in a lot of amps. You can still get amps with spring reverbs, but a lot of them are starting to become digital reverbs. The thing with spring reverbs is they've got a very characteristic sound when the amp gets knocked. They make this kind of chirpy kind of sound, and we'll have a look at that with a real amp. But this particular model has a simulation of that chirp, which from time to time can get a little bit annoying. But the whole sound of a spring reverb has got quite a boing kind of sound to it, hence the name spring reverb. So you can hear that little chirp at the start of the note. So if I turn the level down there a bit. So spring reverbs were renowned for surf music. Moving right along, we have a plate reverb. Plate reverbs were particularly common for using on vocals, but I like plate reverbs when I'm recording clean acoustic guitars. Other clean instruments sound quite good with plates. So it's quite a nice flat reverb. Then we've got the hall, which, as the name suggests, simulates being in a large hall. Hall reverbs from me are great for when you're using more dirty sounds for soloing. Now that's got a lot of wet signal, which I would tend to cut down. So take a bit of the effect level down, and I wouldn't generally have as much decay in a solo sound as that. Probably a little less level again. That's not bad. So again, might be a little bit too wet. Now, the thing to remember when you're playing live is that when reverb is amplified through a PA, it becomes over accentuated. So you may need to cut back the reverb again. Reverb also has a a large impact depending on what type of environment you're in. So if you're in like a pokey little club, you may find that reverbs get soaked up, whereas if you're playing in a big auditorium, you're going to have a lot more natural reverb in the room, so you may need to cut back the amount of reverb in your sound. There's no magic kind of amount. It's just a matter of experience and basically having experimenting with what reverb sounds good in what kind of environment. But I generally err more on the side of caution, and I'm fairly conservative with how much reverb that I add to my sound when I'm playing live. When you're recording in the studio, you've got so much more control over the sound of it. Our next one is a room reverb. So room, as the name suggests, is like being in a smaller room. It's not a hall, it's a room. So this is good if you want to simulate an amp being mic'd in a room. So I might have a little less and a shorter time. Let's go to an overdriven sound. So it's very short decay, just gives me that kind of bit of breath to the actual overall sound, almost like the amplifier's been mic'd and it's capturing the air between the speaker and the microphone. And the gate reverb. Gates were very popular in the 80s, particularly on snare drums. Basically, the reverb is triggered when the drum is hit, and then cut off by like a noise gate. So it's got a really distinctive sound. I'll just go to a dirty sound for this. Turn. Hear how it's choked? For me, I never use a gated reverb on guitar. It just doesn't have a natural sound to it. So you may reserve this particular reverb for using when you're recording if you needed to add it onto a snare drum or something of that nature. But that pretty much wraps up the different models and the different parameters within our reverb pedal. This amplifier's got a real spring reverb built into the bottom of it. Basically, the reverb itself consists of what's known as a reverb pan, and the audio signal is fed into the reverb pan and converted into waves which travel through these springs, and then the sound is mixed with the original dry signal of the amplifier. And it's got a very characteristic tone about it. The amplifier itself just has a single control which allows you to adjust the intensity of the actual reverb. But it's fully dry, and as I bring some of the reverb in, it really starts to bring the amp to life when you start introducing a little bit of reverb. In the 50s and 60s, there were very few effects around. The spring reverb was one of the first effects to sort of hit the scene, and it can be heard on pretty much every album from the 50s, the 60s. Surf music was built on the sound of the spring reverb. So it's got a really characteristic tone. The other notable thing about a real spring reverb is that if you actually bump the amp, you can hear the springs vibrating. Yeah, some players in the olden days used to use this as a special effect in itself. But anyway, that's a fairly simple reverb, been around for decades now, but still a very popular effect. Before we wrap up this chapter on reverb, I just wanted to quickly show you the Digitech Digiverb, which has an extra model being the reverse. So this works like a reverse envelope. So if you play a chord, for instance, sounds like it's swelling in, the reverb is in reverse. So for instance, you might turn the decay down. Incidentally, this pedal has the word decay as opposed to time. They're both exactly the same parameter. So decay is the length of time it takes for the reverb to basically fade out. So I've just set the decay low. So, it's quite an interesting effect, but, I'm not convinced of how actually practical it is in a live sense. I would probably use it occasionally, maybe for bringing in a big guitar chord. It might be handy for, a reverse cymbal hit or something like that. This one also has a church simulation there as well, which is... Different reverbs that you'll see around the place may have names like chamber, cathedral. They're all just basically simulations of large rooms. So each reverb is basically meant to simulate some kind of environment. So that pretty much wraps it up for reverb for us, but we're going to, at the end of this DVD, start throwing a lot of these effects in together and just really see how they work well together.